Hi, and welcome to this lecture on cognitive verbs, where we're going to cover the topics of Bloom's taxonomy, learning objective, and thinking tools. So how all those four concepts are related. So just like every other lecture, we've got the learning objective. So if there's an exam in your course, these are possible exam questions. Okay? So let's have a look at them. First thing I want you to be able to do by the end of this lecture is be able to identify the cognitive verbs within Australian curriculum science. I want you to be able to look at a piece of text and determine its text structure. And based upon identifying its text, select the appropriate thinking tool for that particular text type and also cognitive verb. And I also want you to be able to create learning objectives based on content descriptors. So really we're looking at the intersection between a thing called cognitive verbs and the Australian curriculum, how those two things are related. But before we talk about those, what I want you to do is to head to the QCAA website, the Queensland Curriculum and Assessment Authority website, and download this document, the Glossary of Cognitive Verbs. So these are verbs, verbs being doing verbs, or one of the functions of verbs, and what makes them cognitive verbs are these are thinking verbs. Now, depending upon where you look, the definition tends to vary from place to place. The definitions that we'll be using in this course and the definitions that you'll be using out in the field are those provided by the QCAA, and they have my stamp of approval. Excellent. Okay, so make sure you download that. That's how we're going to define all of the cognitive verbs that we're going to be looking at throughout this course. So before we start talking about cognitive verbs, I think it's important to backtrack and talk about something called Bloom's taxonomy. Now, if you've never heard of Bloom's taxonomy, it's actually quite big within the educational field. So this gentleman here and a bunch of colleagues in the 1950s, they were charged with, by their universities, gathering up all the course profiles and sifting through the learning objectives in those course profiles. And their job was to put them into categories. Now, the first category, large category that they put those objectives into were what domain they belonged to. So when they looked at them, there were three broad domains: the cognitive domain, the psychomotor domain, and the affective domain. Now, when we refer to Bloom's taxonomy, we're really just talking about the cognitive domain, the thinking domain. Okay? Rightio, so that work was done back in 1950s. They separated them first into three categories, and then within the cognitive domain, they separated them into 6 different types of thinking that you can see on the board there, from remembering, understanding, applying, all the way up to creating. Now, that's actually the modern representation of Bloom's taxonomy. In a moment, we'll have a look at the original conception. So what you can see right there is the conception by Anderson and Crothwell. So Lauren Anderson and David Crothwell. Lauren was a student of Ben's and David was his colleague. So they got together and they updated the taxonomy to what you can see there. Now, the other important thing that to do with the taxonomy is that we tend to break it up into 2 levels: lower order thinking skills, such as remember, understanding, and applying, and higher order thinking skills, analysing, evaluating, creating. And I'll talk about the implications of thinking about thinking in terms of lower order and higher order. Okay, right. So the original taxonomy actually looked like this. It was hierarchical in nature in terms of knowledge being down the bottom, comprehension all the way up to evaluation being the highest level of thinking that you can actually do. When it was updated, those noun forms of the verbs, they got changed into the verb form. Well, knowledge didn't become knowing, it actually became remembering. And that was a more accurate representation of what you're actually doing at that level. Another significant change was at the higher levels with evaluating and synthesizing. So not only did they switch positions, but synthesis didn't become synthesizing, synthesizing became creating. And that was just a more everyday use of the word. Apparently teachers didn't understand what synthesizing actually meant. Okay? So what you can see there in terms of the new terms are how we currently think about Bloom's taxonomy. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can think about Bloom's taxonomy, and you can see those here. Now, the most common way is that the one in the middle there, the hierarchical model. So in the hierarchical model, that's where people think of thinking as being strictly hierarchical, that remembering is lower than understanding, all the way up to creating being the highest level of thinking that you can do. Now, something which is a slight variation on that is the partial hierarchical model, where the people who use this model, they say that, oh yes, there's clear leveling in the lower orders of remembering, understanding and applying. But once you start getting up to creating, evaluating and analysing, there's really little difference between those, and we can't really separate those out into levels. So people who go with this model conceptualise those higher order thinking skills as being equivalent. Now, the model that I actually prefer is the last one, the flat model. So the flat model, people who think along these lines say, well, they're just all different types of thinking, but you can do those types of thinking at low levels as well as at high levels. So for example, you can remember at a very low level. So for example, I can remember the fact that 1 + 1 = 2. That's stored in my factual memory. It's something that I'm able to recall. But I'm also able to recall quite complex things, okay? So for example, I could remember pi to 10 digits, for example, or pi to 20 digits. That's obviously quite harder, a cognitive task, than remembering 1 + 1. So you can do something at quite a low level, remembering at a low level, as well as remembering at quite a high level. Same thing with creating. So you can create at a very low level, so you can generate questions. Why am I here? Why is the sky blue? So they are very low level types of creation, but you can also do creation at quite a high level. So if you're creating a car or a piece of work or an essay or a report, they are all types of creation which are at quite a high level, as opposed to generating questions, which is creating questions at a very low level. Now, the type of model that you prefer to use is completely up to you. There's really no right or wrong way to think about Bloom's taxonomy, but it is a good idea that you have in your mind some way of thinking about thinking. Okay, so when should you use these verbs? Okay, well, everywhere and anywhere that you can. So the most obvious places in your lesson planning. So your lesson objectives, your learning objectives, or WALTs, as some schools call them, is definitely, that's where they'll highlight. So that second slide that you saw earlier, my cognitive verbs there are highlighted in red. Okay, they should also appear in your questions when you're asking students, when you're interacting with colleagues, with your class. You're going to be using cognitive verbs. They should be driving your question in class. In your lesson activities, when you design an activity, when you design a worksheet, the cognitive verb should be front and center, and obviously they should be front and center in your exam questions. So where should you use cognitive verbs? Pretty much everywhere. Okay, now it's your turn. What I want you to do is to pause the video at this point, go over into the Teams site within your course and download, go into the Files section, into, I think it's something like the Australian Curriculum Science. Go ahead and download the scope and sequence. Now you can either print it out and you can highlight the hard copy, or you can open it up in your PDF viewer and you can highlight it there. So whichever way, doesn't really matter, but what I want you to do is to highlight wherever you see cognitive verbs in the Australian Curriculum Science. If you don't know what the cognitive verbs are, please refer back to that QCA document, which actually defines all of the cognitive verbs. Excellent. So let's move on to informational text structures, because this is another way that you can actually start using in a very effective way your knowledge of cognitive verbs, because it very much relates to a thing called informational text structure. So what that implies, so what that actually means is that within the West there are 5 ways that we primarily convey information. Okay? And we're going to have a look at those because they are the key to a lot of learning. So to help your students construct and build their web of knowledge, your use of your understanding of informational text structures is key. So you should really be teaching your students about informational structures because it helps students unpack text. This is one of the ways that we embed literacy within the sciences. We help students interact with the variety of scientific texts that they're going to come across within the academic setting as well as in the real world. It's going to help students become independent and lifelong learners because you're not going to be there everywhere in their adult lives giving them guide questions, showing them, oh, this is the important bit and that's not the important bit. What we're doing is providing them with lifelong skills. They can go into a job and read and understand manuals and reports and computer printouts within their job. And even more importantly for you when you're teaching is that it's going to help your students be less reliant on you. Because a lot of times when we lecture as teachers, we pre-package, we pre-chew all of the information and then we just feed it to our students. We spoon feed them. And what we're trying to do is try to do that as fewer times as possible. Okay, so spoon feeding is bad. Try not to do it. So what you can see here are the 5 different text structures. Okay, now so there are 5 and each one has a corresponding go-to thinking tool which helps you unpack it. It also has a bunch of other indicator words to tell you, hey, this is this type of text structure. Now, once you know the type of text structure, that's generally associated with a cognitive verb. And I'm going to show you some examples of how cognitive verbs relate to text structures, relate to thinking tools in a slide later on. Okay, so here's a teacher's version of that same information, obviously displayed somewhere on a teacher's board. Now you can see there the names, the names of the structure. The only variation to that list that you can see on the left there is that I would call that first one list and describe, but the rest I would call it exactly the same. So let's go through one by one each of those structures and explain those a little bit more. Okay? But before we do that, we just need to expand your notion of text. So when I say text from now on, I don't want you to just think of words and sentences and paragraphs and textbook chapters. I want you to expand your notion of text to include multimodal text. Okay, so go and talk to your lecturers in literacy and talk to them about multimodal text, because texts are more than just words on a page. So texts are really any form of communicative device. So for example, this lecture is an audio-visual communication device. Because it's using audio and visual, that makes it a multimodal form of communication. Okay? You can also have kinesthetic forms of communication. So gesture is a type of communication, therefore it's a type of text. Sign language is a type of text. Dance is a type of text. Okay? And we can also think of these different types of text as being traditional or modern. So books being traditional, blogs being modern, wikis being another type of modern text. Okay? So what I want you to do is to pause the video here and try and brainstorm as many different types of texts using your new understanding of what texts are. So go ahead, jot those down. Once you've done that, unpause the video and join us back here. So let's go through now each one of the text structures one by one. The first one, the most commonly used text structure in the sciences, is list describe. So you might have a textbook chapter describing the characteristics of fish, describing solids, liquids and gases, describing mitosis, describing the rock cycle. Okay? Now, so when you see descriptive words, for example, for instance, specifically, in particular, that should clue you in that what you're reading is a structure which is list describe. Now, one of the go-to thinking tools is a concept map, what you can see there. But equally as effective is the T-chart. And if you have a look in your course text, there are many types of T-charts, not just for list describe. There are T-charts also for the other types of thinking that we do. The next one that we're going to have a look at is order sequence. So this is where a textbook or a YouTube video might describe the flow of events of a sequence. So for example, it might be the stages of mitosis, or it might be the life cycle of a butterfly, or it might be how the hormones and the organs of the body work in concert during the menstrual cycle. Okay? Those pieces of text are best re-represented using a flow diagram. So you can see there a flow diagram of making peanut butter and jelly, but it could just as easily be mitosis. It could just easily be protein synthesis. Okay, so when you have processes, know that you've got order and sequence. So therefore, a flow diagram is the most appropriate thinking tool. A slight variation on the flow diagram, but still very much that there's something over here and that's connected by an arrow to something else. So when you have cause and effect, and there's plenty of cause and effect in science. So for example, you can see there the cause of those rainy clouds has those three effects. So this is a modified flow diagram, not just going from one element to another element to another element, but causes and effects. You can have one cause going to multiple effects, or two causes going to one effect. Okay, so it just depends upon the scenario that you're looking at for the type of visual representation that you would use to re-represent that original piece of text. Okay. The next one we'll have a look at is the compare and contrast. So this is where you are looking for similarities and differences. So the example that you can see there is where you're asking the students, well, what's same and what's different between lions and tigers? What's same and what's different between solids and liquids? So there are many, many, many examples, especially from biology. You can say, look at what are the similarities and differences between alkanes and alkenes in chemistry. What's the difference? What's the similarities and differences between the theories of general relativity and special relativity? So anytime you're looking at similarities and differences, know that you've got compare and contrast. And so therefore the most appropriate tool there is either the Venn diagram, which is my personal favorite, or a double bubble. Again, the double bubble is in your course text. Problem solution, you can see there a reoccurring theme of that flow diagram idea. So this is where a problem is being presented and then the solution is being presented directly after that. So there are certain signal words that you can look for to tell you, oh, I've got problem solution here. So consequently, thereby leads to, because of, therefore. Those are words which you are either going to read on a page or hear in somebody's speech to indicate that they are conveying a problem solution situation. So a flow diagram is generally the best there. Excellent. Okay, so in that preceding section on informational text structures, hopefully you're taking some notes. So now what I'm going to ask you to do is to apply your knowledge. Now I'm just going to flick through these and I'm going to keep talking, but as you use them, what I want you to do is to pause the video at various points so you can read the text. And then once you've figured out what text structure it is, just unpause the video and go into the next one. But I'm just going to keep talking like this. So if you haven't paused the video at each of those moments, you're going to hear that whole speech. Okay? So what I want you to do is to have a go at identifying the structures used in those texts. Bring the answers to the next session that we have and we'll talk about those. Okay? Now, in terms of cognitive verbs in your course text, they're actually referred to as task verbs. Potato, potato, no one really cares. They mean the same thing. So the pages that you should earmark for where are the cognitive verbs in the course text are pages 55 to 109. So it's quite a sizable portion of the text which is handed over to that. Okay? Rightio. Now, another task for you to really dig deep and make sure that you understand cognitive verbs. I want you to go through that series of steps so you can see there. So grab that scope and sequence document that you got earlier. And what I want you to do is to select a content descriptor. So a content descriptor is obviously something that describes content, and it's in that big table. So pick any one of those from 7 to 10, because obviously this is junior secondary. What I want you to do is to write a learning objective. Once you've written your learning objective, you should have used a cognitive verb. From that cognitive verb, you should be able to select the right thinking tool which goes to that, and a text, which I don't actually have written there. And then what I'd like you to do is to tailor that thinking tool to that chosen text. Okay, so let me give you an example. So from the biological sciences substrand of science understanding, I've chosen this one. So this is year 7. There are differences within and between groups of organisms. Classification helps organise this diversity. Now, you're not going to cover a single content descriptor in a single lesson. That one content descriptor is jam-packed full of learning objectives that it is your job as a teacher to generate. Okay, it's not the job of the curriculum, it's your job to generate the learning objectives. So you've got to read and interpret the meaning of that statement and think, oh, I want the students to be able to do the following. So for example, from that content descriptor, I've written that learning objective. Identify similarities and differences between amphibians and reptiles. Okay? So similarities and differences, that's compare and contrast. So my learning tool will be the Venn diagram or the double bubble. Okay? Rightio. Now, because I'm lazy, I just jumped on YouTube and I typed in differences between amphibians and reptiles, and voila, up popped that video. So there's my text. I'm using a modern audio-visual text, which is multimodal in nature. Now, I'm going to pair this with a pedagogy called explicit instruction. Now, I'll talk about explicit instruction in a future lecture, but suffice it to say, this is where I model how to fill in the Venn diagram. We do one together, and then I hand over the completion of the rest of the Venn diagram over to students. So when I hand over the responsibility to students to complete the entire Venn diagram, I'm going to be asking students to work in pairs. So there's my grouping strategy. And then to review, I'm going to bring the whole class back and we're going to go through the whole Venn diagram together. Okay? So hopefully you can see in that demonstration there, that example there, just how everything is related, how the curriculum is related to cognitive verbs are related to thinking tools are related to the text types are related to pedagogy, and the grouping. Everything is interconnected when you are thinking about planning in teaching. Excellent. So, as a reminder, you should have gone through the scope and sequence and highlighted the cognitive verbs. You should have participated in that quiz earlier in terms of identifying a text structure of a particular type of text. And you should be able to choose the appropriate thinking tools in that very last activity. And as part of that last activity, you should have been able to create a learning objective. And we didn't quite get to it, but over time, when you become a teacher, you should be able to tailor that thinking tool to your students and also the text. Thank you.